Welcome to Know Before You Go. This Sunday's readings are a challenge to us in a variety of ways. First, let me say that the Gospel according to Matthew challenges us, but we could look at it in a little different light and say, take the high road. The bar is high, but don't be afraid to accept that challenge. Our first reading is from one of the books of wisdom literature in the Old Testament, namely the Book of Sirach, and it talks to us about wisdom. So on the one hand, the gospel is telling us that we need to stretch high, take the high road, do not be afraid when the bar is set high, and that if we trust in God's wisdom and grace, we will be able ourselves to choose that for ourselves. So what is it in the Gospel of Matthew that challenges us in that way? It pushes us beyond what following simply the commandments that we find in the Old Testament might suggest to us, as demanding as they are in themselves. So for instance, you'll hear expressions like this: "You have heard that it was said to your ancestors, 'You shall not kill.' But I say, whoever kills will be liable to judgment, and who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment." In other words, it's not only a question of do not kill, but do not get angry. Likewise, you have heard that it was said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you, everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery. So you see how Jesus here is pushing everything one step further or one step higher. Likewise, again, you have heard that it was said to your ancestors, "Do not take a false oath, but make good to the Lord all that you vow." But I say, do not swear at all. So that text that we have begins with Jesus saying, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law, but rather to fulfill it." In other words, do not think that simply what I've been teaching suggests in any way that we can set aside the basic core commandments of the old law, of the scriptures, the Old Testament, but rather Jesus invites us, encourages us, and challenges us to go one step further, as he often does when he says that not only should we love our neighbor, but love our enemy as well. Is this perhaps asking too much of us? Are we able to live in accord with that challenge? We are disciples of Jesus. This is what Jesus is teaching those who follow him, and we follow Jesus. So we too need to take the challenge seriously. One of the statements that we have in the gospel text is especially poignant, I think. It says, "You fool, if you bring your gift to the altar and there recall that your brother or sister has anything against you, leave your gift and go first to be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer the gift." In other words, as is so often true in the prophetic tradition, Jesus desires worship. But that worship which Jesus really desires is that which is based upon following the commandments, the teaching of the prophets, pushing ourselves one step further. In other words, in this particular text, it's not only a question of coming and giving God praise, even with our Sunday liturgy, but if there's some hardness in our hearts, if someone has been left unforgiven, if the possibility of reconciliation is there before us, we should indeed take care of first things first. And those first things are love of neighbor in so many situations. Well, this kind of pushes us in a way that makes me ponder, am I really able to live what Jesus asks of us? But if we go again to that first reading, the Book of Sirach, it states so clearly that this choice is ours. Whether, if you wish to put it this way, if we take up our cross and follow Jesus or not. For the reading from the Book of Sirach begins, if you choose, you can keep the commandments and they will save you. Whatever one chooses shall be given them. Immense is the gift of wisdom. In other words, you may recall in another place in the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy, where it is said, I place before you life and death. Choose life. So likewise here, the book of Sirach is saying, I place before you the commandments. Choose them, because that will give you life. That will be life-giving. And in the New Testament, Jesus is saying, if you can observe what I ask, not only to not kill, but indeed not to become angry in your heart in an unreconciled way towards your brother or sister. It's not only a question of not committing adultery, but actually also do not begin entering into those things, fantasies, whatever it might be, that could lead you in that direction. In other words, challenge oneself to live profoundly what discipleship really means. In our second reading, as Paul writes to the Corinthians, the very same message is there, that indeed it is through the gift of wisdom, if we stop and ponder wisely, and through the gift of wisdom, that we realize we do have that choice. And which road will we take? In terms of the poet Frost, we could say, will I choose the road less traveled, or will I not? These last weeks, both with our readings and in the light of what happens in the world and the divisions in our country, as well as polarization in the church, lines from Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities has often come back to me. These are the best of times, these are the worst of times. This is a spring of hope, a winter of despair. In some ways, we need to choose whether we will be beacons of hope in our world, and that however the conflicts in our country might go unresolved and the tensions increase, that we must take the higher road. We must go one step further, and indeed we must say, as followers of Christ Jesus, we are not simply going to take the easy path, the road so frequently traveled, and let ourselves get caught as well and become victims of the polarization, taking sides too quickly. Rather, let us give an example in our country and in our church of what, one, it means to forgive, two, what it means to live a life of hope, and then, finally, to challenge others as well to go the noble path and to seek that which is good and to move beyond those divisions that separate us so readily and even angrily from one another. Yes, pursue justice, seek the good, but do not let rancor sink into our hearts like cement in such a way that indeed we have hearts of stone rather than hearts of flesh. Yes, heavy perhaps, the challenge from Jesus, but we know in our hearts and with wisdom that we can choose a different way to interact and be present in our society and church. And that presence, which will be a sign of hope, is for us to love one another as God has loved us.